By that, I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيدة الرئيس.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the suffering of millions of Syrians is increasing these days as a result of the extreme cold in Syria. They're finding it difficult more and more to acquire their basic needs, notably heating supplies such as fuel, electricity, not to mention food, medicine, and healthcare. And that is due to the blatant economic terrorism and the policies of collective punishment represented by the unilateral coercive measures imposed by the United States and the European Union on my country, Syria, in grave violation of all international legal standards and the principles and provisions of the UN Charter. The catastrophic impact of this illegal and inhumane siege has reached all aspects of life in Syria. It greatly limited the ability of the Syrian government and its institutions to provide basic needs. It also prevented us from implementing many of the cooperation programs and projects between the Syrian government and its partners, such as United Nations and its specialized agencies, the ICRC, and dozens of foreign NGOs licensed to operate in Syria, including projects reaffirmed by Resolution 2585. Madam President, the unethical acts and practices of some influential countries opposed to Syria reveal the falsehood of their claims that they are concerned about the humanitarian situation in Syria. These uncover their politicization of the basic principles of the humanitarian work by using it as a tool to pressure and blackmail to achieve their anti-Syria political objectives. Western countries that are permanent members in this council and their allies have impeded efforts to improve the humanitarian situation in Syria. They withheld their funding to the humanitarian response plan. The fulfillment of their pledges during the past year did not exceed 45% of the overall amount required by the United Nations. They obstructed the implementation of the provisions of Resolution 2585 on taking practical steps to meet the urgent needs of the Syrian people and enhance cross-line access inside Syria and implement early recovery projects to provide education, health, and water. They also impeded deliberately the adoption of the strategic cooperation framework between the Syrian government and the United Nations to support its efforts to achieve the SDGs and guarantee that we are not left behind and provide favorable conditions for a dignified, voluntary, and safe return of displaced to their homes. Madam President, a few days ago, on behalf of my government, I delivered 2 identical letters on the crimes perpetrated by the terrorist ISIS organization and the separatist SDF militia, as well as the U.S. forces in Al-Hasaka Governorate, which claimed the lives of innocent civilians and injured many others, including women and children. It led to the destruction of many civilian facilities and infrastructure. It led to the displacement of thousands of Syrian families into areas under the control of the Syrian state seeking safety. What happened in Al-Hasaka in the past few days shows the inability of the United Nations and its specialized agencies, as well as other organizations, to meet this challenge. Although we have launched an urgent appeal and we provided many facilities so that they can carry out their work, the Syrian government bore the brunt of the burden imposed by the practices of parties to these events. Although we have limited capacity to meet the needs due to the coercive measures imposed on the Syrian people. the Syrian government made every effort to respond to the needs of the displaced, whether shelter, food, medicine, relief items, or heating supplies in this extreme cold weather. Madam President, some delegations in their statements talked about the targeting of civilian health and education facilities. They used the work of the advisory committee to make false claims, and they asked for accountability. Given that these delegations forgot about the crimes of the illegal global coalition that destroyed the entire city of Raqqa and other cities, they claimed the lives of many Syrian civilians. The crimes carried out by the U.S. forces in Hasaka a few days ago should remind them of that fact. U.S. forces within hours destroyed 2 educational facilities, as well as a fuel station, a bakery, and that these attacks cost civilian lives. Shouldn't they be held accountable for these acts? Madam President, the crimes of U.S. occupation forces complement the crimes of the Turkish regime forces and their terrorist affiliates in northwestern Syria, notably Al-Nusra Front, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, designated by your Council. Although we made several requests over the past few years to move against these terrorist groups, the Security Council remains unable to shoulder its responsibilities, given that some Western countries continue to oblige Erdogan's regime that know very well how to blackmail and deceive. They provided him with protection from any accountability for his crimes of murder, plunder, confiscation of lands, displacement, demographic changes, Turkification, deprival from drinking water, trade in the suffering of refugees and displaced. And some of these crimes are tantamount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Madam President, my delegation reaffirms our position of rejecting the so-called cross-border mechanism, as it violates the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. It allows Al-Nusra Front and other terrorist affiliates to continue to control Idlib and to detain its residents as hostages and human shields. My delegation also stresses that internal access in cooperation with the Syrian government is the best way to meet different needs in Syria. The efforts made by the Syrian government, the facilities and approvals granted should be commended and appreciated. Terrorist groups and separatist militias, on the other hand, are impeding internal access in order to find pretexts to extend the cross-border mechanism and to continue to violate Syrian sovereignty. Madam President, before I conclude, allow me to remind you of the suffering of our citizens in the occupied Syrian Golan as a result of the practices of the Israeli occupation authorities, including oppression, terror, arbitrary arrest, and confiscation of land. I call on the Council to condemn the holding of a meeting by the Israeli government in the occupied Syrian Golan on the 26th of December 2021, and the declaration that they will be building 2 new settlements in the occupied Syrian Golan in a blatant violation of international law and relevant UN resolutions. We also look forward to an urgent action by the Security Council to put an end to the recurrent Israeli attacks against the sovereignty of the Syrian territory and to guarantee the withdrawal of Israel from the Syrian Golan along the lines of June 4, 1967. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.